This tutorial is going to cover Lamia Part 2, and it's going to cover the latter part of Lamia Part 2. Just a brief introduction, topics that we've talked about before, but just some contextual information. Lamia was written in 1819, and that's the year that Keats met Fanny Brawne. In this poem, a snake is transformed into a beguiling woman who seduces a character called Lycius with this unbound sensuality. Now, historically, a Lamia is this mixture, this hybrid of an ethereal goddess and a grotesque monster. And so we've got the theme of illusion in this poem. Lamia has the ability to reshape herself according to her whims. In this poem, however, she's not evil. Okay, Lamia is usually an archetype of the femme fatale, whose charms kind of leech the independence of her lovers, leaving them shells of themselves. But Lamia in Keats' poem doesn't intentionally use her magic powers to cause pain. So in this poem then, she represents creativity and she represents the imagination. She's very fragile, so she embodies the fragility of the imagination. And she demonstrates that even though imagined things aren't real, they aren't evil. This Lamia simply wants to be loved. It relates to Keats' ideas about the human soul then. He says that we're made up of sparks of divinity, but we're not souls until we acquire identities. So in other words, we're not truly alive until our personalities have been developed through experiences. And that's what Lamia desires. She wishes to experience all of the experiences of life in order to complete her soul. Some structural issues then before we start. You can see from this excerpt that Lamia is written in rhyming couplets, okay, broods and woods, okay, it's a half rhyme, but then we have diadem, dewy gem, and so on. So we've got rhyming couplets. They're open rhyming couplets. It means that each couplet, you can see on that first line there, the enjambment. So each couplet, we can read straight on. They're open. They're not closed, which would kind of be a seemingly completed thought on each line. Why is that? Well, it links to Keats' ideas and Wordsworth ideas and romantic ideas that poetry is spontaneous, that it is expressing thoughts, and that thoughts aren't rational and therefore cannot be rationalized into certain syllables and certain beats. So he might have chosen this form as a way of structuring his writing to let us know that it is intuitive, it is spontaneous. Okay, I've covered the rhyming couplets. Then the other thing that you need to notice about Lamia is that every so often we have a longer line. It's called an Alexandrine. It's a line of 6 iambic feet. So if you think of iambic pentameter meaning 5, and it's those 5 stressed, unstressed syllables, da-dum, 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 da-dum. Then an Alexandrine is one more, da-dum. It's 6 iambic feet. Why does he do that? Well, again, he's playing around with the movement of the poem, with the speed of the poem, and it makes the poem more irregular. Again, relating to this idea that the topic, love, the imagination, and so on, are not regular. They cannot be expressed in regular rhythm. 2 more things to be aware of are caesura or stanza breaks. Again, seem sporadic. They're not, but it's not strictly divided into stanzas. The breaks are usually a natural place for Keats to turn his attention away from the present scene and towards something else or someone else. So we're going to have a change in location or action or time. Finally then, our omniscient narrator, omniscient, all-seeing. So our third person omniscient narrator in Lamia. He sometimes has the role of storyteller, so he tells us what's happening, but quite often he comments on it, he reflects on the events of the plot, and he directly addresses the reader. So in little asides, so we do get some narrative perspective, we do get some narrative comments, and I'll draw your attention to that as we go along and as we annotate. There's an additional effect here. The effect is that The reader is reminded not to lose themselves in the action of the plot. The narrator kind of gives us little nudges every now and again that tells us to maintain this questioning attitude. He questions us, and it makes us question what's going on in the narrative. So it allows the narrator to make comments on subjects. And so at times he's quite cynical. He's this cynical onlooker, reminding us to stay guarded against seeing Lamia as anything other than a snake. Another structural aspect of this poem that you need to be aware of is the frame and narrative, and we've covered that in Lamia Part 1. The initial story then, where we have this nymph who is incredibly attractive and who Hermes, amongst others, is deeply in love with, and Hermes strikes a deal with Lamia and convinces her to reveal the nymph to him, and in return he will turn her into a woman. He will grant her wish. Now this what happens when Lamia grants that wish then is that Hermes and the nymph are united, and they, despite her initial reluctance, they kind of go off into the sunset as a successful love match. We're reminded in the opening lines that we have these references to magic and myth, where it starts in Olympus. So we've got this mythical realm, and we've got this escapist world then of gods and nymphs. The love affair between Hermes and the nymph raises quite interesting questions to do with power struggles, because in this case, the male is the more powerful in this relationship. Now later that will contrast with the relationship between Lamia and Lysias. Some commentators believe that by giving Hermes a happy ending and Lysias this grim death, Keats is suggesting that it is the male figure who should remain powerful in love affairs. And maybe that is a direct comment on his own situation, where he was he was subject to the dominance of Fanny Brawn, who teased him and who had the power in that relationship. The contrast then between these two stories needs to stay at the back of your mind. As we go through, which we're going to do now, we're going to annotate Lamia, and we are going to have a look at the narrative techniques and how the plot progresses. Just to bring you up to speed then, what's happened in part 1, just to take you through, you can see we've got a little chronological timeline here. We've had our snake that's transformed, and this is following the frame and narrative of Hermes and the nymph. She's transformed into this beautiful woman, and she pursues and makes Lysias fall in love with her. However, our character of Polonius is introduced. Here he is, Boo-hiss. He's introduced in the first part as well, and there's a sense of foreboding that really surrounds Polonius, and both Lamia and Lysias react quite negatively to him. But it doesn't matter, because the narrative cuts off and they are transported to this kind of enchanted house or enchanted palace, and it is there that we leave them at the end of part 1. Part 2 then opens at that same place. Lysias, against her better judgment, has persuaded Lamia to marry him, and we pick up the narrative where they are preparing for the wedding day.
Every day. Okay. We're going to start then midway through part 2 of Lamia. It was the custom then to bring away the bride from home at blushing shut of day, veiled, in a chariot heralded along by strewn flowers, torches, and a marriage song with other pageants. So the custom is to celebrate marriage, and up to that line we have a description of a marriage celebration. But this fair unknown had not a friend. And notice the pathos there. The reader starts to feel sympathy for Lamia. So in the first section, we thought of her as this deceptive snake, but here we start to feel sorry for her. She's alone. This fair unknown had not a friend. That's emphasised, so being left alone. Lysias was gone to summon all his kin, and his kin is his family. And look at her resignation here, knowing surely she could never win his foolish heart from its mad pompousness. If you are pompous, you are self-centered. What's self-centered about him wanting to marry her? Well, he wants to show her off. And she knows that she can never win this battle. He will always want to do that. So she will never win his foolish heart from its mad pompousness. She will never dissuade him not to be motivated by that kind of self-interest. And so she set herself high-thoughted how to dress the misery in fit magnificence. So the misery is how she feels. And she feels miserable. Why? Well, because she's worried that at the wedding she's going to be unveiled for what she really is. She doesn't want the mortal world and her fantasy world to collide. She's absolutely petrified. But she will dress the misery. She will dress beautifully and she will smile. So again, we have our theme of deception. All is not what it seems. She did so. But 'tis doubtful how and whence came and who were her subtle servitors. And now we have our description of how she enchants this palace. She makes it absolutely beautiful, but what we need to understand is that it's all enchanted and it's all false. And this whole section... Okay, so I'm moving a little bit further there. The whole section is false. It's enchanted and it's beautiful, but it's not real. And we've got incredibly visual imagery. I say visual. The first thing I'm going to notice actually, there is a noise of wings, so I've got auditory as well. Auditory imagery then is to do with sound. Let's have a look at how this setting is described. And this is the setting of the enchanted palace. So before we've had our setting of the woods, we've had our setting of Corinth, and now we've got this enchanted palace. About the halls and to and from the doors there was a noise of wings, till in short space the glowing banquet rooms shone with wide-arched grace. A haunting music, so again it's our auditory imagery, sold perhaps and loaned to the portraits of the fairy roof, made moan throughout, as fearful the whole charm might fade. So we've got our constant reminder that this can't last. This whole section reminds me of the party of Gatsby's, and it's well known that Fitzgerald was a huge fan of Keats. He said that Keats wrote the most beautiful imagery he'd ever wrote in a letter to his daughter Scotty, and you can see how Fitzgerald borrows from Keats. We've got our auditory imagery, we've got our light imagery, we've got our glowing banquet room that shone, and now we've got our natural imagery. Why? Well, because Keats was a romantic, and the romantics believed that nature was perfection. So we have our natural imagery here. Fresh carved cedar, mimicking a glade, okay, and that's like a leafy glen of palm and plantain, met from either side, high in the midst in honour of the bride. 2 palms and then 2 plantains, and can you see how it goes from palm and plantain to 2 palms and 2 plantains? So we've got our image of excess, and so on. From either side their stems branched one to one, all down the aisled place, and beneath all there ran a stream of lamps straight on from wall to wall. So canopied laid an untasted feast, teeming with odours. Lamia, regal dressed, silently paced about, and as she went, in pale, contented sort of discontent, missioned her viewless servants to enrich the fretted splendour of each nook and niche. Now we've got our oxymoron here. Contentment is happiness, discontent is unhappiness, and she is in a happy kind of unhappiness. So there is a sense here she knows it's going to come to an end, but she will put a happy smile on, and she will enjoy the moment while she can. Our natural imagery continues. The fretted splendor, I read that bit. Between the tree stems, marbles playing at first, came jasper panels. Then, anon, the burst forth creeping imagery of slighter trees, and with the larger wove in small intricacies. And here's what Lamia does, approving all, she faded at self-will, and shut the chamber up, close, hushed and still, complete and ready for the revel's rude, when dreadful guests would come to spoil her solitude. So what do we have there? We have our comment on the city, we have our comment on the people who live in cities. They're rude, they're dreadful, and they spoil perfect dreams. Okay, so reality, and we can talk about the cities, can't we, because the Romantics were fearful of the growth of the cities and the impact that it would have on their natural environment. So reality spoils the solitude of nature. And of course the imagination, because that's what Lamia represents. Okay, before moving on to this next section then, I just want to highlight something that I said in the introduction. Can you see the way this section, it's not regular, the poem isn't regularly organised or structured into regular stanzas. You can see that we've got very different lengths of stanza. I don't need to make your eyes funny going through it. And you'll see that looking on your own page. But each section seems to deal with a particular event, or it shifts. When we shift to a new stanza, we shift to a new time, or we shift to a new focus, or new characters to focus on. So here, the day appeared, tells us that time skips forward. Okay, so that is why we have our stanza break. Time skips forward, and it skips forward to the wedding day. Again, our negative description of the human world continues. All the gossip route. Okay, so all the gossiping people from the town come along to this wedding. And then we have our explicit authorial or narrator comments, okay? So we have our explicit narrator comment. And he addresses Lysias. Now, I said authorial before. The boundary is blurred between the narrator's voice and Keats's voice, i.e. the author. Okay, so it would be reasonable when you are talking about Lamia, when you are analysing Lamia, to say that we are listening to Keats's voice as the omniscient narrator. I would refer to the omniscient narrator, but I would perhaps acknowledge that it could be suggested that it is Keats's voice that we're hearing. And he explicitly comments, he addresses Lysias directly. And look what he says to him. Oh, senseless Lysias, so stupid Lysias, madman, wherefore flouts the silent blessing fate's warm cloistered hours, and show to common eyes these secret bowers. Look at the labial consonants here. Labial is labial consonant is L. Okay, it's an L sound. So we have our labial consonants. It sounds hushed. Okay, he's conspiring with Lysias, and he says, why are you tempting fate? Why have you invited reality into these secret bowers? So why have you let everybody see your secrets? Why have you let everybody see into your imagination? So it's a real comment here on to Lysias that Keats thinks he is a fool for letting reality become mixed with his dreams and with his imagination. And so the reality then continues to be described in a really negative way. The herd approached, each guest with busy brain, arriving at the portal, gazed amain, and entered marvelling. And now, I always say that this bit is really like 21 Grimmauld Street. 21 Grimmauld Street in Harry Potter, where you've got the street, but this particular house is only seen by those who know it's there. And that's what happens here. They knew the street, remembered it from childhood, all complete without a gap, yet never before had seen that royal porch, that high-built fair demesne. So in they hurried all, mazed, curious, and keen. Save one, and save one means except one, who looked thereon with eyes severe, and with calm planted steps walked in austere, and austere means strict. 'Twas Apollonius. So we have our characterization of Apollonius here as severe and as austere. So he seems really harsh. You heard the phrase harsh reality? That's what happens here. Apollonius represents reality. And look at his attitude. Something too he laughed, as though some knotty problem that had damped his patient thought had now begun to thaw, and solve, and melt. 'Twas just as he foresaw. What's happened here? Well, Apollonius had this worldly wisdom. He represents philosophy, he represents logic, he represents reason and reality. And his suspicions are being proven right. Again, it is our sense of foreboding at the end of this section. And Lysias meets Apollonius. Apollonius then, he met within the murmurous vestibule, and a vestibule is like a really small area, so the M alliteration, it sounds muffled, as though he's keeping some kind of secret. His young disciple, okay, and that's his student. And look at what he says to Lysias. "'Tis no common rule, Lysias," said he, "for uninvited guests to force himself upon you, and infest with an unbidden presence the rights of wrong of younger friends. Yet I must do this wrong, and you forgive me." If Apollonius represents reality then reality here, and logic and thought are uninvited. They infest our dreams, they are unbidden, they force themselves upon us, and yet they are necessary. And they're all the messages that Keats maybe has about reality. Okay, I said before about the way that different sections sometimes cut across each other, or they change something, either they change the setting or they change the focus. You can see that the focus of our last section ends with Lysias welcoming Apollonius in, but then Keats' narrative cuts across that. So, the reader is highly aware of this impending catastrophe, but Keats holds back that narrative, and in doing so, he creates this sense of tension, he lengthens our suspense, and he slows the pace deliberately. Look now at the next section. This imagery is opulent. The whole scene is filled with sensuous imagery, with images of excess. Again, it really reminds me of Gatsby's Party, and let's have a look why. Of wealthy lustre was the banquet room. Okay, lustre is a kind of shining light. Again, it sounds ethereal. There are clues that this isn't real. It's something that has been enchanted, filled with pervading brilliance and perfume, so we've got our scents. Before each lucid panel fuming stood a censer filled with myrrh and spiced wood, so we've got our scents there as well. Each by a sacred tripod held aloft, whose slender feet wide swerved amongst the soft wool-woofed carpets. So there we have our sense of touch. Can you see how the layers of imagery are building up? So we've got our sense, Then we've got our light, and now we've got the touch of the soft wool woofed carpet. Now as I'm reading this, you should be hearing the S sounds. We've got a lucid panel fuming stud and censer, fed with myrrh and spiced wood, sacred tripod, slender fleet, white swerve, soft carpets, and so on. So what do we call that? It's our sibilance. And the sibilance sounds sensuous. So we have sensuous description adds a really hushed and enchanted tone. In terms of aspects of narrative, what are we describing? We're describing the setting of the palace again. It extends the description before. Remember in Gatsby when we had our 12 crates of heaped oranges? Well, here we have our images of excess as well. 50 reeds of smoke from 50 censers. Their light voyage took to the high roof, still mimicked as they rode along the mirrored walls by twin clouds odorous. 12 sphered tables by silk seats in spheres, high as the level of a man's breast, reared on libid's paws, upheld the heavy gold of cups and goblets, and the store the rice holes of Ceres' horn. Now Ceres is a deity, it's a Greek deity, and she is the goddess of agriculture. So again, she is a symbol of plenty. And in huge vessels, wine, come from the gloomy tun with merry shrine. Thus loaded with the feast, the table stood, each shrining in the midst the image of a god. So we are reminded that we are in some kind of cross between the mythical world and the real world, but there are mythical, unreal elements here. We have our caesura, our stanza change, and it focuses on the guests now. And the guests are being treated to kind of pampering treatment. When in an antechamber, every guest had felt the cold, full sponge to pleasure pressed by ministering slaves upon his hands and feet, and fragrant oils with ceremony meats poured on his hair. Okay, so it's this kind of pampering treatment. Imagine, you know, when you get on a plane or you've had a meal and you get given a flannel that's kind of hot and you hold it to your face or hold it to your skin to cleanse. So they're going through this kind of cleansing ritual, this pampering ritual. They've had oils poured on her hair. And then they all move to the feast in white robes, and themselves in order placed around the silken couches. Interesting though, look what they're bothered about, wondering whence all this mighty cost and blaze of wealth could spring. So in the midst of this beautiful wedding, this gorgeous love story, what do the guests wonder? How much it costs. So they apply reason and logic to love. And I think Keats' message is that in doing that, when we apply reason and logic to love, it somehow demeans it. It makes it less lovely. It ruins it.
Okay, look at the way then that this scene builds to a crescendo. Again, you might see why it reminds me of Gatsby's Party. Louder they talk, and louder come the strains of powerful instruments. It really reminds me of that crescendo at Gatsby's Party when the orchestra starts playing and they get louder, and it says something about the moonlit ledge towards the sun. It's quite similar here. Louder they talk, and louder come the strains of powerful instruments. The gorgeous dyes, the space, the splendour of the draperies, the roof of awful richness, nectarous cheer, beautiful slaves, and Lamia's self appear now, when the wine has done its rosy deeds and every soul from human trammels freed, no more so strange. For merry wine, sweet wine will make Elysian shades not too fair, too divine. So what have we got here? Well, we've got some very odd phrases that again remind us that something is not quite right. We've got a roof of awful richness. Again, it's an oxymoron. Why? Well, this is a poem of contrasts. And so we have our contrast between the awfulness and the richness. This suggestion then that there is something about this scene that is really too much to handle. The odd phrase clashes. We've also got the immediacy of our narrative, and that's created through this list. Look how long the sentence is. This whole section is all one sentence. And we've got our clauses, our subordinate clauses that keep building up layers and layers upon layers of detail. Now, Keats, in several of Keats's poems, he talks about escaping, and he talks about escaping through opiates, such as morphine, and plants and kind of drugs, I suppose we'd say now. But he also talks about escaping through drink. He talks about, in one of his poems, he asks for a draught of vintage that he might leave the world unseen. So this idea that through alcohol, our senses are numbed, and when our senses are numbed, we escape reality. And that's what you have here. And it's only when all of the senses of the people at the party, I beg your pardon, are dulled and are numbed that Lamia appears. Now, when wine has done its rosy deed, and every soul from human trammels freed. And a trammel is like a kind of trap, or some kind of restraint. So when the guests have drank wine, then human restraints no longer apply. They are free from the usual boundaries of accepted behaviour. And it is then that Lamia appears. Lamia's self appears. So she only appears when people's senses are too dulled to truly notice what she truly is. We're told then, soon was god Bacchus at meridian height. And Bacchus is, as you would expect, the god of wine. Flushed were their cheeks and bright eyes double bright. Okay, so everyone's senses are heightened. Garlands of every green and every scent, from vales deflowered or forest trees branch rent, in baskets of bright osier gold were brought high as the handles heaped, to suit the thought of every guest. Okay, so every single guest has had his whims catered for, that each as he did please might fancy fit his brows, silk pillowed at his ease. So all the guests are completely comfortable, reclining on these silk pillows at ease, and every whim and every desire that they've ever had is catered for at this party, because this party represents the imagination, and as such it is an image of perfection. Okay, this next section, it's already annotated, as you can see, and it asks us, the narrator asks us three questions: what wreath for Lamia, what for Lysias, and what for the sage old Apollonius. You can see then that a sage is a teacher, and our narrator asks us this question and then he answers it himself. So he wonders what their character is like, because in ancient Greece and in Rome as well, then a wreath symbolised character. You would wear a wreath of leaves around your neck, and it signified what kind of person you were. So he asks this question, and then he describes what he sees. He describes the scene. And the first character, I should say, that we turn to is Lamia. So how is Lamia characterised? Upon her aching forehead there hung the leaves of willow and of adder's tongue. So what have we got? We've got pathos used to characterise her here, her aching forehead. So it really makes us feel sorry for her. This is a character who's in pain. We're told she wears the leaf of willow, and that's from the weeping willow tree. Okay, so it's a symbol of sorrow. but also adder's tongue. The narrator keeps reminding us, it's a sly reminder, Lamia is a snake. We next deal with Lysias, and he's described as the youth, a symbol, well, to signify or to draw attention maybe to his immaturity. And look what the narrator says, quick, let us strip for him the thyrsus, that his watching eyes may swim into forgetfulness. Now the thyrsus is a symbol of Bacchus, the god of wine. And the narrator wants to get him drunk so that he will forget what he's about to see. So it's our sense of foreboding, again, something bad is going to happen. And for the sage, and we know that sage is a teacher, let speargrass and spiteful thistle wage war on his temples. Look at the language there, spiteful thistle. We've got a really harsh consonants. The narrator wishes pain on Apollonius, which suggests he dislikes what he represents. And if it's Keats's voice, he dislikes philosophy, he dislikes science. And our next comment then, our narrator's question is a direct comment on that. Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? So philosophy is described as cold. It's an explicit comment on philosophy. It's cold, it's unfeeling, it's dispassionate. Now this next section refers to a lecture by the Romantic critic William Hazlitt, and he suggested that science and technology restricted the imagination, and how they did it was that they destroyed beauty. The example he gave was Isaac Newton, who destroyed the beauty and wonder of a rainbow by scientifically explaining it. Now let's think about a rainbow. As children, what do we think? We think that rainbows are there to pave the way to this pot of gold, and that there are going to be leprechauns along the way, and it's magical and it's enchanted. What did Newton do? Newton told us that rainbows are created because different wavelengths of light are refracted differently through water. An incredibly scientific and cold and boring description. And that's what Keats talks about here. There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof and her texture. She's given in the dull catalogue of common things. Look how reality is described, dull and common. And these next 5 lines are really the key, I think, to the whole poem. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings. Okay, so understanding how something is created will destroy magic. I always think about the magic trick when someone's sawed in half, and I sometimes think, I'd like to know how that happens, and then I think, no, I wouldn't, because it would destroy it. We like to believe that there's magic, because the possibilities that opens up are endless. Whereas if we can explain everything due to logic, then that's really quite depressing. And I think that's what Keats believed. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line. Now remember we talked about Augustan poetry and this idea that they had to be quite rigid in structure, certain number of lines, certain number of syllables. Well, look at how Keats deals with that. It could be a comment on the rigid rules of Augustan poetry, conquer all mysteries by rule and line. Keats didn't write poems that conform to this structure. We've already said that these are open rhyming couplets. We've got the enjambment here and here that really gives it a sporadic rhythm. So it's not a regular rhythm. We've got our odd Alexandrine thrown in there. Again, we talked about it earlier. So our structure, he messes around with the structure of poetry. And that's what he's saying here. If you try to discuss and explore mysteries in a certain number of syllables, you're going to destroy it. He continues, empty the haunted air and gnomed mine, unweave a rainbow, and we've dealt with that image before. But look at what he compares all of those to. As it while, so at the same time, made the tender personed Lamia melt into a shade. So he compares unweaving a rainbow to Lamia melting, this idea that something magical is destroyed by reason and thought and reality. Tender personed Lamia, our narrator sympathises with Lamia there. Okay, our narrator switches then, and he switches from a commentator to a storyteller now. Again, I've already annotated this bit because I've just done it and it didn't record, but never mind, we won't go into it. Okay, so he storytells, he tells the story, he goes back to the events that are unfolding before our eyes that he's explaining. And we have our focus on Lysias, so we've had our caesura and our focus changes, and we said that that is how this poem is structured. By her, okay, so by Lamia then, glad Lysias, sitting in chief place, scarce saw in all the room another face. And what does that mean? Well, he's devoted to her. He shut out everything else. He shut out consciousness. He's of everything apart from her. He shut out reality. So enthralled is he with his dreams and with this figment of what we know is a figment of his imagination, because obviously she is an enchanted snake. Till checking his love trance, and when we check ourselves, we kind of catch ourselves and kind of get jolted back into reality. And here's what he does. He toasts Apollonius. A cup he took full brimmed, and opposite send forth a look across the broad table, to beseech a glance from his old teacher's wrinkled countenance and pledge him. Okay, so to pledge someone is to toast him, and his countenance is his face. Look at Apollonius's reply, or response even, and look at the brutal alliteration. As an R there. Look at the brutal alliteration used to describe it. The bald-headed philosopher had fixed his eye without a twinkle or stare, full on the alarmed beauty of the bride, brow-beating her fair form and troubling her sweet pride. Lysias then pressed her hand with devout touch, as pale it lay upon the rosy couch. 'Twas icy. Okay, so somehow Apollonius's stare, it's almost as though he can see right through her, and his stare changes her. And she has this extreme physical reaction. 'Twas icy, and the cold ran through his veins. Then sudden it grew hot, and all the pains of an unnatural heat shot to his heart. So there is something unnatural happening here. Why? Well, Lamia's not real, is she? She's not a mortal. She is an enchanted being, and she starts to become transformed now. And Lysias is shocked. Lamia, what means this? Wherefore dost thou start? Knowest thou that man? Poor Lamia answered not. And can you see how poor Lamia, the narrator obviously sympathizes with her here. Now we've got dynamic characterization in this poem. Dynamic means that the characters change and our perception of the characters change. So in part one, Lamia was described as this seductress, really quite evil and sly and cunning. Here, our narrator calls her poor Lamia. So the characterization then invites us to sympathize with her at this point. He gazed into her eyes, and not a jot owned they the lovelorn, piteous appeal. So they've lost all of their appeal. More he gazed. His human senses reel, some hungry spell that loveliness absorbs. There was no recognition in those orbs. Lamia, he cried, and no soft-toned reply. Look at the negative language, not a jot, no recognition, no soft-toned reply. Our poem has taken a turn for the worse. Not a jot owned they the lovelorn, piteous appeal. More he gazed. His human senses reel. And can you see the sense of emergency here? We have a sense of urgency. The pace picks up with the short clauses. Some hungry spell that loveliness absorbs. There was no recognition in those orbs, and her orbs are her eyes. So no longer does she recognize him. She's in some kind of trance. Lamia, he cried, and no soft-toned reply. Look at the negative language here. Not a jot, no recognition, no soft-tone reply. So we've got an incredibly negative tone through the negative language. tone of the poem completely changes now. Everything that was described and was used to develop the gorgeous imagery before suddenly ends. The many heads, the loud revelry grew hush, okay? So the auditory imagery is silenced. The stately music no more breathes. And even nature is destroyed. The myrtle, and a myrtle is a tree, sickened in 1,000 reeds. By faint degrees, voice, lute, and pleasure ceased. So whatever has happened has ended all joy. Look at the deathly imagery. We've got the myrtle sickened, and now we've got a deadly silence, step by step increased. And see the slow pace. And the slow pace adds a real sense of foreboding here. It's chilling because it's so slow. A deadly silence, step by step, increased until it seemed a horrid presence there, and not a man but felt the terror in his hair. And look at Lysias's panic now. Okay, so Lysias is incredibly agitated. Lamia, he shrieked, and nothing but the shriek with its sad echo did the silence break. Begone, foul dream, he cried, gazing again in the bride's face. Now that's odd, because when he says begone, foul dream, look at how he describes what she has become. She is a foul dream. Of course, it's ironic because it's implied that the enchantment is somehow dissolving and she is becoming what she always was. And so when she was a woman, she was the dream. And when she was a snake, she was reality. So dreams and reality are blurred. And of course, it's ironic that Lysias thinks when she becomes a snake, she is the foul dream, when actually she's becoming what she really is. And look at how she's described. Now no azure vein wandered on fair spaced temples, no soft bloom misted the cheek, no passion to illume the deep recessed vision. All was blight. Okay, so all beauty has faded. Again, we've got our repetition. No azure vein, no soft bloom, no passion to illume. Lamia, no longer fair, sat there a deadly white. So she has somehow been transformed through Apollonius' stare. And now Lysias addresses Apollonius. Shut those juggling eyes, thou ruthless man. Remember, all the time, Apollonius represents reality, and reality then is ruthless. Turn them aside, wretch, or the righteous ban of all the gods, whose dreadful images here represent their shadowy presences, may pierce them on the sudden with the thorn of painful blindness. So Lysias threatens Apollonius here with blindness. Now, some critics, I'll just write that down. Okay, some critics think that this poem, because it's peppered with references to sight and seeing things clearly, that it is a reference to poetry and how it is the poet's job to see things, to make things clearer. If that is true, then Apollonius is what is helping Lysias make things clearer here. So again, the boundaries become very blurred. Because look at how he talks to Apollonius. He threatens him with blindness. Again, it's ironic because Lysias really is blind, isn't he? Lysias is the one who can't see Lamia for what she truly is. So he asks that the gods may pierce them on the sudden with the thorn of painful blindness, leaving thee forlorn in trembled dotage, the feeblest fright of conscience, for their long offended might, for all thine impious proud heart's sophistries, unlawful magic, and enticing lies. Look at how he talks about what Apollonius does. He talks about impious, proud heart, sophistries, and sophistries are truths, and enticing lies. So Lysias sees reality as incredibly cruel. And he tells the rest of the company at the wedding, Corinthians, look upon that grey-beard wretch. And again, the language becomes incredibly negative. Mark how possessed his lashless eyelids stretch around his demon eyes. Corinthians, see, my sweet bride withers at their potency. Sweet bride is Lamia. Lamia is the imagination. So reason kills. The imagination. Look at Apollonius's response. This word here, sophist, it's short for philosophist, okay? It's just so that the line scans with the rhythm that Keats wanted to create. Fool, said the sophist, in an undertone gruff with contempt, which a death-nigh moan from Lysias answered, as, heart-struck and lost, he sank supine beside the aching ghost. So Lysias sinks to the ground, and he is completely heart-struck and lost. Fool, fool, repeated he, while his eyes still relented not nor moved. So again, it's this idea that Apollonius, it's his sight that reveals what Lamia truly is. So Apollonius represents truth and reality. I've talked to you in the past about this idea that Lamia is an allegory, and we said that Apollonius represents Charles Brown, and Charles Brown did not want Keats to devote himself to Fanny Brawne because he thought that she would never requite his love, that she was a tease, and that she was dangerous. She was dangerous for Keats because she was causing him to be depressed, and that would not help his illness, and it would not help him to write beautiful poetry. And you can almost hear Charles Brown's voice in Apollonius here. Apollonius talking to Lysias, Charles Brown talking to Keats and saying he is a fool. Look at how he believes that his job is to protect Lysias. From every ill of life have I preserved thee to this day. Shall I see thee made a serpent's prey? And that is the reason that he wants to protect Lysias. So Apollonius thinks that he is protecting Lysias. Is he? Well, we've got clues all the way through this poem that a life lived purely for pleasure can't last, that it's unhealthy, that we had this obsession between the two of them. We had this palace that is built purely, the fairy roof is only supported by music. It's unrealistic. So yeah, has Apollonius got a point? Certainly. And I think that Keats wants us to understand every point of view in this poem. And Apollonius does not want Lysias to be a serpent's prey. He does not want him to suffer. But look, when Apollonius utters the word serpent, then Lamia breathed death breath. Look at the internal rhyme adding to the seriousness there. And in revealing what she truly is, that kills Lamia. The sophist's eye, like a sharp spear, went through her utterly. Have you heard that phrase, seeing right through something? This idea that you can see through a facade, that's what happens here. But look how reality or reason or logic or thought or Apollonius is described: keen, cruel, prescient, stinging, incredibly negative language. she, as well as her weak hand could any meaning tell, motioned him to be silent. So just before she dies, she kind of motions him to be silent, vainly so. He looked and looked again a level. No. A serpent, echoed he. So he says it again. No sooner said than with a frightful scream she vanished. And Lycius' arms were empty of delight. Okay, so when she dies, the effect is that his life is devoid of all joy. Is this Keats' plea to Charles Brown to let him pursue this relationship with Fanny Brawne? Maybe. Lycius' arms were empty of delight, as were his limbs of life from that same night. So it actually kills him. On the high couch he lay. His friends came round, supported him. Okay, so he's still got his friends, but they're not enough. Without Lamia, he cannot exist. Without Fanny Brawne, Keats can't exist. Without the imagination, we only live a life half-lived. No pulse or breath they found, and in its marriage robe the heavy body wound. So what have we got? We've got Keats, we've got the poet. He's this passionate dreamer. He's led by emotion in the same way that Lycius is. The job of the poet then, Keats, is to use this narrative to make people view the world as he did, full of beauty and delight, and not one that can be described through rational philosophy. Finally then, I just need to draw your attention to the conclusion because it contrasts. We can compare it with the framing narrative of Hermes and the nymph. Some critics believe that because Hermes has a happy ending and Lycius suffers a grim death, Keats is suggesting that the male should remain powerful in love affairs. We can cross-reference that with La Belle Dame sans Merci and this idea that when the man gives himself up to seduction by a woman, it can never end happily. We've got two poems that both support that view. Okay, I'll finish that there. Please view this tutorial alongside the tutorial on Lamia as an allegory. And finally, just to make sure that you absolutely understand the plot, then there is a tutorial on the plot and on the structure of Lamia as well.